Hello, everyone. Welcome to Freedom International live stream. Today is August 22, 2024 at 12 noon. And I think I want to get into the habit of saying the date now because, there's just so many things going on. And hopefully in the years to come, which I hope it would be better years, then, we could always have this conversation, but see the progress of it. And we welcome Vanessa Beeley, and I welcome Roy and Hartmut, who have been my regular and my good friends since 2020. And of course, as of this moment, I welcome also Kevin Jenkins, who's been playing a role as my special guest host. It's just because I don't know. I like to put people together who sincerely have their hearts in place and have their conscience in place, and then help this platform to truly have a conversation for the audience to know the truth. Okay, so and that's Kevin. And Kevin, meet Vanessa Beeley.
Hello, Vanessa. How are you?
Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to see everyone.
Nice to meet you also.
And I know that at some point, Drago Bosnic, who's been following Vanessa, is going to jump in. And I messaged Drago on that you're in and how long can we have you. So welcome to everyone. And she doesn't need a long introduction. She's been a frequent guest of ours. And for those who have been following her, and for those new to her, she really has been doing an extensive, massive work when it comes to what's happening in West Asia, and then but very knowledgeable in what's happening globally. So and her heart is in the right place, that she even had to relocate from UK to Syria, where she's really boots on the ground. So for me to have her at this moment is a blessing. Okay, so we seize the moment that she could be here. And so welcome again. And she's well known to a lot of independent journalists, who there's not a lot of them who truly see the whole situation in such a way that we don't get led to the misinformation. Okay, so she's that kind of independent journalist, and she's been had some numerous awards also. So Vanessa, why don't you invite now our audience now on where they can connect with you?
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. As always, you're much too kind. Basically, the best place is probably Substack. I'm still hanging on in there on YouTube and X, Telegram, Patreon, but Substack really is the main one now, where I try to publish everything. And I work with ukcolumn.org in the UK, doing a regular news program with them every Wednesday.
Thank you, Vanessa. And she's really been very active in doing her Substack. So we can go straight to the conversation. And one of the recent articles that you wrote is entitled "The Resistance versus Israel Alliance." So I know that and that was the time when I invited you. But of course, there are so many succeeding articles that you have written. And the recent one is about Israel's nuclear Samson threat, and what's that is about the ceasefire. Okay, so I think what I wanted to begin is how most of us really are thinking. When I say most of us, those critical people who are aware that we're really at the cusp of all this nuclear war, and others are just continue to live under the rock. So I made friends with the GPT chat, and I just said, how many countries or which countries have nuclear weapons or nuclear arsenals? And then after I share you what I learned from the GPT. It says that the United States was one of the first ones, and then Russia came came next in 1949. And of course, we also have India in sometime in 1974, and France in 1980, and Pakistan in 1998. And of course, we have Israel and North Korea. And yet, in a lot of this conversation, I usually just hear Russia, US, and I seldom hear about Israel. So when I saw your article, it was a great thing to read. So why don't you just kind of update us, beginning with your most recent article? And after this, since Kevin is a special guest host, I'd like to pass it on to him, because you never know, he might be busy and leave us early. So,
or it might be so boring you go after 2 minutes.
So yes, Vanessa.
Yeah, I think, why I wanted to remind people about Israel's nuclear program. And now there are various estimates that Israel has between 100 and 400 nuclear warheads. It depends on who you're reading. But let's say something in the middle, let's say around 150 to 200 nuclear warheads that they've been developing at the, as it's called, the basement. They've been developing it in the basement, because basically Israel is not party or signatory to the non-proliferation treaty for some time. I mean, in the 80s, Vanunu Mordecai, who was working within the nuclear industry in Israel, actually turned whistleblower and was providing information about their very, let's say, opaque nuclear development program. And of course, he was arrested and put in jail for 18 years for treason. 11 of those years were spent in solitary confinement. He was released in 2004, but basically is heavily restricted. He's not allowed to speak to foreign journalists. He's not allowed to travel to certain places, etc. And, everyone has been focusing very much on the threat of nuclear escalation between NATO or Ukraine, however you want to look at it, and Russia. And even if you look at the upcoming elections in the United States, you're seeing, for example, what I call the America First Club, talking very much about, well, at least Trump isn't going, he's going to get us out of the war in Ukraine. He's going to prevent a nuclear war, et cetera, even though Trump is heavily invested in Israel. And under the Trump administration, 2020 to 2024, although he didn't start any wars, as I'm constantly being told, he didn't end any either. And he brought us actually to the brink of escalation in the region with a number of measures that he brought in. And that included the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes, the leader of the PMU forces in Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces that are part of the Iraqi military now. He introduced, under the sort of auspices of Jared Kushner, he introduced the Abraham Accords, which were in effect a normalization campaign with the regional states like Saudi Arabia and UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, etc. So Trump, in my opinion, although he didn't start any wars, he was instrumental in maintaining and sustaining the wars and sustaining US occupation in the region, but particularly in Syria in the northeast. And so people, are very focused, particularly in the States with this upcoming election, on preventing this nuclear war with Russia. But absolutely nobody is talking about the threat of a preemptive nuclear strike by Israel. Because we're looking at a state that is acting without any accountability, with complete impunity. It is slaughtering, torturing, abusing, raping, massacring Palestinians on an hourly basis, and has been for, let's say, almost a year. Now, Israel thrives on this idea of its aggression, its kind of rabid dog aggression, being a deterrent to all of its opposing states or all of the hostile states in the region that make up the resistance axis, responding to Israel's aggression. And Israel has a long-term policy of preemptive strikes. For example, in Syria, we're constantly being preemptively struck by Israel on an almost, daily basis, attacking military bases, attacking Iranian militia, Lebanese militia, who are here fighting the terrorism that the West and Israel created and allowed to invade Syria. Now, the Samson option comes from the idea of Samson being tied between the two pillars and destroying the entire temple to free himself. And Ariel Sharon in 2003 made the very clear statement that if there is any danger of Israel falling or Israel being destroyed, we will preemptively use nuclear weapons to prevent that fall, to prevent that failure of Israel. And that included, according to Ariel Sharon, European capital cities, even American capital cities. He stated quite clearly, our Air Force is capable of hitting anywhere, and we will do it if we feel that Israel is about to be destroyed or is about to fall. So Israel has made no secret of their intent to use nuclear weapons preemptively if there is any real threat against Israel's existence. And right now, we're entering a period, we have been for some time, where Israel's existence is under threat. And you have, obviously, now the threat of retaliation from Iran. It always sort of makes me smile that all of these European countries and US allies are all going to Tehran to talk to Iran to tell them to back down. Nobody is talking to Netanyahu to tell him to stop assassinating the leadership of political and military organizations within those countries. So, for me, the greatest fear right now is nuclear escalation, but it's not going to come from Russia. Potentially, it could come from NATO member states. But the biggest risk for me right now is Israel, and nobody's talking about it, which I find, kind of extraordinary. You're muted, I think.
I apologize.
Yes,
I like to mute myself
Sorry.
before I interrupt anyone. But Vanessa, that's a really interesting dynamic. I've been following it myself. But let me ask you a question. I'm always interested in what would be the best American policy? What would be the best policy? And let me give you an example. I mean, I was on a call with about 60 Black American men, and we've been growing. We're growing it up to about 10,000 men, and we're talking about our role in America. And there was a big global discussion happening about what's happening in Southern Sudan and what's happening all around Africa, and we've been focusing on that. But what would be the best policy for America to deal with this particular issue? For Americans, for America, protecting our sovereignty, not getting into these foreign wars. What would be the best policy? Because we're going through the same thing. We're trying to design the best policies that will move Black men into the 21st century, right? Because that's a big issue. And I think it's something that's going to happen. And I think politically it's shifting in this country. What would be some of the moving parts to that, I should say? You shouldn't have to outline the whole policy. What would be some of the moving parts? So if we're all talking about this international catastrophe that's upon us, what would be the first couple of things that you think I should bring up in my discussions?
Well, I think, first of all, the US should end its unlawful occupation of sovereign nations across the global south, but particularly in Syria, for example, where the US is occupying Syrian oil, Syrian agriculture, and preventing the supply of that oil and agricultural product to the civilians in Syria. That's number one. Two, stop all weapons supply to Israel, impose economic sanctions on Israel, And, you know, I think one of the most important things for the United States and the UK and the EU is to de-Zionize your political system, end lobbying, and get the Zionists out of your political system, because that is what is poisoning the well.
Yeah, yeah. Do you believe that integration, historically, it's really interesting you say that, because we talk about this in my household all the time, and it always turns out to be very ugly, by the way. So,
normal.
but it's really normal, right? Yeah. One of the things that we're all perplexed about the fact that this country is singular focus on, you know, manipulating the, for instance, I'll give you an example. We had a discussion the other night about all of the military bases all around the world. And everybody in our group was saying that we understand why that is, because our military no longer protects our sovereignty. It's protecting the military industrial complex. It's protecting the globalists. They're not there to protect our sovereignty. So that's one of the reasons why we believe there should be none of those kinds of operations in any of those countries that are not strategically there to protect our interests as Americans. That's number one. Majority of the friends I have that cover the spectrum, they believe that. Number two, they do believe that the infiltration of our government by foreign actors is becoming a problem, coming, you know, from UK to Germany to the groups that are here now swaying our politics in our country. And believe it or not, across the country, people want to end that. They want to end that. Now, we're dealing with the Christian Zionists. I understand that. That's a whole nother discussion for another day. But but a lot of the people in this country really don't understand the geopolitics that's happening around the world and how it's having a major, major impact on their local life. And they actually think, oh, all of our taxpayer dollars are being sent off to these foreign countries. But I dare say none of our tax dollars are being used for anything, because I believe the dollar doesn't exist anymore. They're just printing money now every day to fund these foreign wars or to fund the military industrial complex or any complex that they deem should benefit from the largesse of the central banks. But it's so many moving parts to that. But what would be the one thing as an American and as a Black American, and I say that proudly, that I should be introducing to a bigger discussion around the country? Because I travel everywhere, by the way. I've been everywhere in this country, and I'm always hearing these kinds of conversations. And because you have such a deep knowledge, I would like you to kind of give me some kind of footprint outside of what you said we should be doing as a country, as a part of my personal discussion. I know that's a lot, but I'm just going to
I mean, I think you talked about the fact that these American bases now represent really profit for the military industrial complex, and I would agree with that. But another reason that, of course, those military bases are in existence, of course, they're there usually on the pretext, for example, in Iraq and in Syria, of the war on terror, which we all know is a complete canard. But they're also there to secure resources. They're also there to prevent any kind of multipolar relationship in the world between the United States and the members of the US-UK-led cartel. And I think, you know, I mean, that's putting me on the spot slightly, but I would think that one of the things that has to be explained to Americans is putting America first shouldn't mean the kind of isolationism that we've seen historically from America. And that kind of isolationism, which effectively leads immediately to the destruction and destabilization of sovereign nations in order to shore up the commodity control and to prevent any other power coming, not even to the fore, but just coming into the arena with the United States, you know. And so it's about empowerment of sovereign nations. I mean, imagine if the US were actually a force for good. Yeah. Imagine if the US were actually a force of really helping those countries to develop, instead of using that as a fig leaf to invade by proxy or directly those countries and to steal their resources and destroy the countries and send them back to the Dark Ages, because that's what America does.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
and so for me, that has to be completely flipped. But the thing is, you've got such and that's not the fault necessarily of the people in America, but you've been gaslighted for so long about other cultures. Everyone in America, their impression of Iran, their impression of China, the Middle East is just full of savages that kill each other all the time anyway.
Yeah.
The
manufacturing descent is I can't remember, but my brain is dead right now. But I wanted to you make a good point about what the media, I call the state-ran media, has done over the last 50 years to us in demonizing these groups. And this manufactured consent is really frightening even for me now. Even in communities I speak all around the country, nobody really has a real grip on all of the things that you understand and we all understand on this call. But I do believe mainstream media, state-ran media, has done such a great job on us and really isolating us from having a bigger conversation with people like you, Vanessa. Look, right now, all of us are being censored. On this show, we'll probably be censored for talking about the things that we're talking about. And that's a frightening aspect as an American, that, we no longer can share our point of views because it's not a part of the grander scheme to sequester our lives and our humanity and our freedom. And, that's one of the things that I'm really, really concerned about, this level of censorship that's going on. And when you look at the UK, I mean, I boycotted the Olympics. I did not watch any of the Olympics. And I'm saying to all of my friends, how can you watch the Olympics in France when you know what France is doing to Africa? They're still colonializing Africa, not neocolonialism. It's still colonialism in Africa. And I boycotted it. And nobody understood it. No one understood it, because you talked about the global South. They all look at Africa in such a weird way that they don't understand that they're still being pillaged by all of these countries that are stripping them of their resources. And that's part of the grander scheme. And I just wanted to ask you, when you talk about Africa, or when you have discussions about Africa around the world, what are they saying? What kind of energy is out there now about what's happening in Africa? Because I see what's happening in the Sudan, and I see what's happening in that Mali region right there, which is absolutely the rebuilding of the Mali Empire. I just wanted to know, what do you think that? What are their perspective about it?
You mean people in the region here?
People, yeah, in the rest of the world that you talk to. I apologize.
Well, I mean, certainly from the perspective here, it's perceived very much that there are now a number of African countries that are freeing themselves from, as you say, the colonialist jackboot, which has been crushing them for decades. Very similar to excuse me, to Latin America and to this region, to West Asia. Yeah. And so from the perspective here, I mean, to some degree, it's a tough life here because of sanctions, because of many things, because of the ongoing conflict on multiple fronts, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a relief for me to live here because I don't have to explain my views to anybody. Okay? Mm-hmm. Right. And here there's if you speak to the street sweeper or a taxi driver or, I don't know, the guy who takes your tickets at some event, they all know exactly what's been happening in Syria for the last 11 years and what is happening regionally, what's happening in Palestine. And for them, what they see in Africa is this liberation. We're going back to the days of Thomas Sankara. Really, this liberation from neocolonialism, from humanitarian aid, from the IMF, from all of this hijacking of their resources, their systems, the digital mining that's going on, the dumping of vaccines. We're seeing them really revolting against that. And from a Russian China point of view, I guess how I see it is that China, and that's of course why we've seen the introduction of terrorist groups in certain areas of Central Africa and in the Sahel, is because China has been developing trade relations in Africa that are far preferable to what the US and the UK and France and so on has been doing for decades. You know, they're building infrastructure. Yes, of course, China is always going to be looking for its advantage in any trade situation, but it's investing in infrastructure.
Yeah,
it's a partnership. That's how I've heard many Africans describe their relationship with China. Now, Russia, how can I say this? Russia is not quite so good, in my opinion. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what Drago thinks of this, but Russia, in my opinion and my experience, is not terribly good at the whole soft power PR stuff. China is much better at that. But where Russia wins over is, I can see Drago nodding, so maybe he agrees with me on that. You know, with China, they're an expert in that, in the kind of soft power. With Russia, it's much more military help, just as they did in Syria from 2015 onwards. You'll see them now, you'll see the Wagner, whichever pronunciation you want, group fighting the Western-backed terrorist groups in the Sahel and so on, and developing a reputation for heroism in the process, and enabling those countries to free themselves from really very familiar attempts by the West to infiltrate and destabilize those countries that are trying to free themselves from regressive economic policies of the West and from the entire settler colonialist complex.
Okay. Well, I'll turn it over to Drago, and I'm quite sure these guys have something more to talk about.
I'm actually enjoying the conversation very much, and I agree with Vanessa with everything that she said, essentially. And I just want to add that when it comes to Israel, since 2019, they've been inducting the Drago 4, which is their most advanced ballistic missile, which has over 7,000 kilometers in range, which means it can reach Washington, D.C. So why would Israel need a weapon like that? That's the first thing you should ask. Like, Iran is not that far, right? You would need just medium and intermediate range missiles for that. So I agree with that 100%. And I agree also that Russia definitely needs to work on its soft power, but historically, they've never been very good at that, unfortunately.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I experience it here in Syria. They're hopeless at it, actually. They're just, and I have discussions with them on a regular basis about how to improve it and so on, but they just, like, somehow that concept just goes over their heads. Yeah,
they're extremely military focused, and they've been for over 1,000 years now. That's just the way they work, I suppose. But that's interesting, because you would expect from a country with such an amazing culture and such a rich culture to be able to exert some sort of media influence, but they don't.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, they are getting better. I mean, quite a funny story if I go back to, because Russia didn't come into Syria until September 2015. And I had been talking about British intelligence operations in Syria for some time before that. It took them until 1 year that they had been militarily operating in Syria to finally start talking to me about what was going on with British intelligence inside Syria. You know, so they, in my experience, they still have this belief in international law, in the UN, in the systems, in diplomacy, in policy, talking to each other, negotiation being the way forward. And I think only after the SMO have they actually really started to figure out how devious and nefarious the West really is. You know, I mean, nothing can demonstrate it more than what's been going on since October the 7th, right? But you know, Russia, it's kind of slow to figure out exactly what is going on and the extent to which the West operates on an intelligence basis, and that includes the media, that includes cinema, Hollywood, everything. That includes the entire misinformation complex.
I just don't think they value the importance of soft power as much as when it comes to hard power. And because I'm a military analyst, I actually have contacts in the Russian military. And when I talk to them and when I ask, why don't you show this? Like, if they do something very militarily important, they don't show it. And I ask them, why not? Because I see the Ukrainians showing everything, like every single drone that hits something, even if it hits a tree, they show it as some kind of a victory. And then you see the Russians fire these incredible missiles that they have, destroying, I don't know, underground bunkers 100 meters underground, which is pretty much amazing from just a scientific point of view. But they don't really talk about it, or we don't really see that in their media. And I think this is the reason for this is the way their military operates. And that's, don't explain anything to the media. You don't give a damn about them. Like, you don't have to say anything. Just let them figure out things on their own, which tells me that they don't really have like a coordination between various moving parts of their power structure, unlike the US, obviously, which is a very well-oiled machine that works in unison, like completely. The media, the military-industrial complex, everything. So I think this is what they lack.
Yeah, and I mean, even, sorry, just to, like, even in Syria, you know, everyone is always criticizing Russia for not using the S-300s against Israeli missiles and blah, blah, blah. And I do explain this endlessly. One, Russia respects the sovereignty of Syria. So therefore, it's up to Syria to defend itself against incoming attacks from Israel. And it does a very good job with its very old Panzer 200s and so on, right? Now, Syria right now is not going to use its S-300s because it's not going to reveal to Israel where they are, or that it even has them, until there is a serious escalation. But the other thing is, what Russia doesn't do, it doesn't talk about the times that it buzzes Israeli jets to force them to turn back to Israel when they're infringing on Syrian airspace. It doesn't talk about the fact that it constantly is bringing down US and Israeli drones. Like, so you're right, it doesn't self-publicize, you know, and it leaves us in this kind of gray area where we're trying to explain what's going on, and that Syria is, you know, Russia is really helping Syria, but it's just not publicizing it. It's not making a noise about it.
I've actually had the chance to talk to some Russian aviation experts, and they know pilots, military pilots who were actually intercepting Israeli F-35s and even American F-22s on a couple of occasions with their Su-35S, which are some of the best jets in the world. And because they have these IRST or infrared search and track systems, they can actually see stealth airplanes without using a radar. So they can actually engage these jets from 100 miles away without any issues, but they never talk about it. They don't even release images that they actually have. And I know that they have like a bunch of images they've accumulated, I don't know, 10 years ago, and they haven't released them yet. So I'm always like puzzled why they don't do that. But it seems that they just don't want to show all their cards. And I think you're right when you say, when you talk about the S-300 that Syria is using. Also, another thing is Syria doesn't have very good radar systems that can track all of the Israeli jets that Israel has actually used to a very great effect in the entire region, because they're very advanced, unlike the US F-35s, which are not very good, but the Israeli ones, they're a different story. I could go on about that for hours, but obviously this is not the time for it. The whole point is, I think that the Russians should change this, because it's going to create a better image of them. Because the critiques that people are always saying about Russia, I see that in Serbia. I see that in a lot of countries that are considered pro-Russian, or they have some sympathies towards Russia. Everybody keeps criticizing Russia, but they don't really react in a media way. They mostly react in an official way. So for them, it's important if an official of the country tells something, and then they would send the ambassador to talk about it. But they would never react to some media outlets saying bad things about Russia or spreading disinformation. I mean, actual disinformation. I know the word has been used into oblivion and it has been essentially denigrated by the mainstream propaganda machine. But I mean, it is a real disinformation. And most of the news that we get about Russia is disinformation.
Yeah.
Maybe someone else wants to come in.
I'll just because I mean we've all learned a lot from you with your journalism, and it was either this morning or yesterday. There was a guy on TikTok, and I bookmarked it, but he got disappeared. It disappeared, of course, and he got arrested under the Terrorism Act.
Richard Medhurst.
Yeah, because he mentioned you, so you might just touch it because that's scary, like because they're attacking real journalists.
Well, I mean, I did, I hate calling, I did a tweet this morning because I have a big issue in the US and the UK about state capture by the Zionist movement, because I think this is one of the biggest problems of our age, actually. Because when you look at, particularly in the UK, if you look at, for example, the UK-Israeli Roadmap 2030, Israel will have a partnership in managing every single sector of UK society. So from cyber and surveillance to health, to education, to the Ministry of Defense, to government, to civil society, etc. And that's already happening, right? The Zionist movement is already fully infiltrated into almost every sector of British society. And I would probably argue the same in the United States, although I'm less informed. And what I was saying was, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. What I was saying was, who prescribed Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist organizations? So this is where I started my thinking. Well, the UK did. But what threat are Hamas and Hezbollah to the UK national security? None. Are Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist organizations? Of course not. Hezbollah has a majority presence within the Lebanese government. Hamas is the government, the Israeli approved and the UN approved government of Gaza, right? So who are they a threat to? They're a threat to the existence of Israel and of Israel's national security, not the UK's national security. So this means that the UK government is protecting Israeli national security over and above British national security. And then what that then means, by prescribing these two organizations that are recognized regional governmental and military organizations that are resisting legitimately under international law the occupation state of Israel, the apartheid state of Israel, and now the genocidal state of Israel that is intent and has publicly declared an intent to ethnically cleanse all of Palestine. That prescription can then be used to target journalists who are supporting an end to genocide. Right. And so that is what has happened. I mean, I was arrested under, not arrested, sorry, I was detained at Heathrow under the Terrorist Act, Section 7, which enables the police to detain me for 6 hours and to question me for those 6 hours, to download everything from my phone, my laptop if I had it, thank God I didn't, to take my DNA, to take fingerprints, photos, etc. So you're treated like a criminal, even though that's only a detention. Under Section 12, which Richard was arrested under, and he was detained for 24 hours, he was put in a cell, he was handcuffed, he was basically treated appallingly, and yet he's walked away. We assume he's on bail, unconditional bail, with no charges, but they're telling him in 3 months they'll get back to him to tell him if they're going to charge him with anything, having spoken to him during his arrest, right? This is quite extraordinary. I mean, actually, my detention was more on the basis that I was a Russian agent rather than a supporter of Hamas and Hezbollah, which was kind of hilarious. But, you know, right now, of course, there is a big movement in the UK to foment civil unrest. And of course, we know who's behind that. The Zionists are behind that. We know that because they're funding and they've been running those kind of anti-far type and far right type organizations in the UK for decades. And so, yeah, you know, I'm supposed to be going back to the UK in October. I have no idea what I'm going to be met with at Heathrow Airport. The lawyer that I've spoken to has basically said to me, look, you're on the radar because you've already been detained. So the chances are they're either going to talk to you again, or they're going to find a reason to actually arrest you and keep you 24 hours and do exactly to me what they did to Richard, because I'm supporting two organizations which threaten Israel's national security. You can't make it up. You know, it's just insane.
Well, you could always fly to Dublin and get a ferry across, and that way then you're not going into the British airport.
Yeah, my friend, someone did actually tell me that. And that might be a final resort. Yeah.
And just for yourself and maybe fellow journalists as well, a lot of the time when they're asking you questions, right, they always want you to sign. So you do not sign anything because you're making yourself liable.
Yeah. No, that's an idea. I mean, I've already booked the flight, but I might actually have a look and change it into Dublin.
Before I pass it to the Hartmut there, because I heard you talking about the ambulances, because we all hear about like the hospitals being bombed and everything, but I think not many people would be aware of the ambulances and the kind of nefarious acts that they're doing to kind of remove ambulances from areas. So you might just touch on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's been ongoing for some time. And I have to say that the terrorist groups that were backed or are backed by Israel that have been operating in Syria since 2011, that's also what they did. So they will bomb an area when the civil defense arrives to rescue people that are under the rubble, then they bomb again and they're killing the civil defense and they're destroying the ambulances. So they're destroying the entire humanitarian relief infrastructure, what little there was of it in Gaza. Yeah, I mean, I can't remember now the exact number of civil defense that have been killed, but it's a huge number, just as there's a huge number of journalists. I think we're up to 170 now journalists that have been murdered by Israel in Gaza, not to mention the children. And, you know, we know from the recent report in The Lancet, which was saying that the estimates are woefully low of Gazans that have been massacred, and that they're talking about numbers closer to 200,000. And there were a recent series of interviews with doctors that had been in Gaza and who have left Gaza, who are also saying that they think probably double that number when you think about the people still under rubble, people that are dying of their wounds, dying of diseases that they can't prevent because they've got no water, they've got no medical care, they've got no medications. And all the doctors are testifying to the fact that Israel is confiscating medications that they received through donations from their countries before they went to Gaza. And Israel is confiscating that at the border.
And I mean, we've heard about the rapes that are going on. I mean, when that came out, it was like people are thinking like this has to be a joke. There's no way they would allow that. And the fact that they're putting it out there, it's like they're trying to create so much anger in the world. But the fact that that was allowed, and you're supposed to have UN and all these different organizations that are supposed to stop, how in the name of God can something like that be allowed?
Well, I've actually written about the culture of rape and pedophilia in Israel. I did quite a lot of research into it. And Israel is effectively a haven for pedophiles. So people that face prosecution in the US and so on what they're doing is simply converting to Judaism, and then they get immediate refugee status in Israel, and there's no questions asked. So this policy of rape, by the way, against children, against men, against women has been going on since forever. I mean, this isn't an isolated case, but of course it was made public because the film was released and so on. But I think what is more horrifying, there was an article, I think it was in Mondovice, where they were saying that 65% of the population in Israel don't want the soldiers to be prosecuted. So in other words, they're saying it's okay for them to rape terrorists, because that's, of course, how it's being portrayed.
I'll pass you over to Hartmut. Thank you very much, Vanessa.
You're welcome.
Hello, Vanessa.
Hi, Nadia.
Thank you so much for being here again. And well, I want to come back to the situation with international situation with respect to Israel. The problem is, or let's say, the point is, we have seen the position of Israel 1 month ago when Mr. Netanyahu held a speech in the U.S. Congress. Yeah.
Yeah.
I got the impression, or I asked myself, who is the real president of the United States?
Yeah, that was just hideous. I mean,
yeah.
God.
So everything was so obvious in this moment, and the Americans, since Oliver Stone said it very straight, he said, the United States of America has never accepted any sovereignty of any state since the 1960s, and they will not accept any sovereignty. And the interesting thing is, for example, if you see the dollar pyramid, and you take a look at the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, in Israel, you see the peak of the pyramid in the Supreme Court. It's really nice. It's really nice to see. It has the same color of the dollar, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we see which role Israel is playing in the world, and with respect to the military technology, I assume they have the most advanced technology, also becoming from all the NATO partners. So
Yeah.
with respect to the military threat, Israel is quite dangerous for the whole world.
Yes. And it's not only the military that it's the I won't say it's irrational, because they develop this image of irrationality, actually. You know, they thrive on this image that they are kind of this, as I said, this rabid, aggressive animal in the region that will strike out at anyone that is threatening it. But they're not irrational. They're psychopathic, possibly, but they're not irrational. And this is, and of course, you also then have to look at the divisions in Israeli society itself, but also this religious veneer over everything, you know. And you talked about the Christian Zionists, but this is a very real aspect of what is going on right now, is that there is a big faction, particularly on the far right, that really believe in destroying Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third most holy site in Islam, and building over that Temple Mount, and that the world has to be pushed into an Armageddon for the second coming of Christ. This is their belief. You know, this is the ideology upon which they base their policies. And the problem is that in the US, you also have a massive Christian Zionist influence. You have a massive Zionist influence, but also a massive Christian Zionist influence. They actually outnumber, I think, the Zionist Jews in the United States. But what you're seeing right now, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I actually couldn't watch Netanyahu in Congress because it was just, I mean, it was hideous. Watching all of those people in Congress, how many times? 50 plus times they applauded him. You know, I mean, what the heck, America? Sorry, I'm looking at you, Kevin, but really that has to be the lowest of the low points in America's history. That really has to be.
Well, I think
bringing Zelensky in was kind of bad enough, but then bringing, Netanyahu in for this showboating experience was just, while he's committing genocide.
Yeah. Well, you make a very, very good point there. We talked about that also. You talked about state capture. It is obvious that this government has been captured. I mean, anybody that hasn't figured that out, they still have a brain virus. But what do you think about what's happening with the reorganization of currency around the world with BRICS? How do you think that plays into leveraging any relationship in the world, the whole BRICS narrative that's unfolding with Russia and Brazil and South Africa? Do you think that's going to have a major impact moving forward on the economies in that region?
Not if war breaks out first. I think it's going to take time. I'm not an economist, but I think it's still going to take time for the system to be really up and running. So what I tend to kind of see that as something which is developing on the periphery of what's going on in the kind of eye of the storm right now.
Yeah.
And I think my fear is what appears to be happening is the US is basically greenlighting everything Israel wants to do. There are no checks and balances. And I don't think it makes a difference if it's Democrat or Republican. I think both of them. In fact, I think Trump's going to be worse, to be honest, if he gets elected. But, there's all this rhetoric about they're trying to rein Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is made as the kind of scapegoat, but he's not. Because he just represents, 3 decades of him controlling things from within the Zionist regime. But in reality, if Netanyahu were deposed tomorrow, and his popularity is increasing, oddly enough, because he is so bellicose, because he is so, he's a good speaker. And even though there is uproar from the hostage families, nobody appears able to contain him. And of course, he's also influenced by the far right members of his regime, which is Ben Gvir. I can never remember his real name because I call him Beelzebub. Smotrich, the finance minister, who have been for some time developing their own far-right militia. So I think it's Alistair Crook that described that as we're going back to the terrorist organizations of 1948 within Israel itself. Ben Gvir controls now the National Guard. He controls the border guards. He's developing his own vigilante militia with the what I call the ISIS settler brigades that have been given American weapons to use against Palestinians in the areas that they are still encroaching upon. So while Gaza is being really slaughtered, West Bank is having its territory stolen from it. I think it's 700 settlements have been approved since October the 7th in the occupied territories. So this ethnic cleansing isn't going to stop. And if the ethnic cleansing is not going to stop, the war with Lebanon, the war with Syria, the war with Yemen, the war with the Islamic resistance in Iraq, and the war with Iran eventually is going to happen.
So
and
are you saying
it's going to allow it to happen?
Yeah.
That's the
Are you
problem.
saying that we're just close to a nuclear war in that region? You dare say that?
Yes.
Okay.
I think there's a very high risk of a preemptive strike by Israel or of an orchestrated false flag, which will lead to that kind of preemptive strike.
Wow.
I think we actually see the preparation for that from the United States military, which now is installing the very low yield nuclear warheads on its submarines. So if you essentially in the military strategy, if you reduce the yield of a nuclear weapon, you're more likely to use it. Because if you have a very destructive weapon, that's the end of the world weapon. So you're going to fire it to destroy a country, they're going to fire back, and that's it, Armageddon. But if you have a very low yield weapon, that means you're going to use it in a war. And there are these warheads, they're called W-76-2, that the U.S. is installing on submarines, which are now being deployed in the Indian Ocean, in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean. So this is very dangerous, definitely. And I think the only way to defeat a nation like Iran, which has thousands of ballistic missiles, is through nuclear weapons. That's the only way to defeat a country like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to emphasize with respect to the intercontinental rockets that, for example, in the past, for example, if someone wanted to start an atomic bomb, this was an intercontinental rocket, and it needed the approval of the president. So several people had to make the approval in order to start an atomic bomb. And with the small warheads, the generals can make their decisions on their own. This is the most important. This is the most dangerous thing here. So, the point and what I want to emphasize as well is that Israel has his ties everywhere. Also, for example, in the Ukraine, the Zionists are also very powerful in Ukraine. So, for example, you have three forces in the Ukraine. You have Zelensky's government, you have the NATO, the US, and you have the Zionists. And this attack on Kursk leads now to the situation that the Russians do not want to make any peace negotiations anymore. So this is also a very dangerous situation, because this kind of escalation can bring whole Europe in the war with Ukraine. Because I don't think that Israel, which is a very powerful source in Ukraine, will give up the Ukraine for the Russians.
No. And also you have to look at the historic collaboration, of course, between the Nazis and the Zionists. That's something that people forget. And I mean, Israel has welcomed Azov Brigade members to Israel since the SMO began. But that historic collaboration, I think it was Stern, the head of the Stern gang, that was basically trying to recruit Nazis in around 1940 to strengthen the brigades, the Zionist brigades in Palestine. But if you go back to Simon Petlura, the first president of the Ukrainian Republic, of course, he made a deal with Jabotinsky, and of course, Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky was basically the founder of revisionist Zionism. Netanyahu's father was a private secretary to Jabotinsky. Netanyahu is a follower of Jabotinsky, which is expansionism. This is about expansionism and control. Go back to the clean break doctrine of 1997, which was commissioned by Netanyahu. One of the authors was Richard Pearl from the US, who's a Straussian, a follower of Strauss, Leo Strauss, and so you have, as I said, these Zionist tentacles in almost every geopolitical decision that has been taken since the foundation of the Zionist movement.
Yes,
it's quite extraordinary. I mean, you kind of objectively, you sort of have to admire how they've developed this power structure, because it's going to be extremely difficult to dismantle it.
The power structure goes also in the Vatican. We can see it. We can see it in the. I forget every time the word LGBTQ. I hope so.
Oh yeah. Better to forget it.
I forget every time. Because this idea was based on the Frankfurt School, which was a social experience in 1923. And the interesting thing is also the Zionists call it a Jewish sect because it was established by several Jews, and it was forbidden during the Nazi regime. But it was established again in Germany, and the Frankfurt School was a very, let's say, communist-orientated society, and they knew how to destroy the family units by this LGBTQ.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that you said that there are so many pedos in Jerusalem or in Israel. So, and we can see how this movement is also infiltrated in the Vatican. Yeah, because the Catholic Church, all the churches accept this kind of movement. So we can see that there is also a Zionist influence in the Vatican. And Karen Hughes, who was a lawyer, I think, for the IMF until 2007, she made a brilliant quote. She said, all the secret services in the world, they work together like banks. And they have to make an annual report to the Vatican. So the Vatican and Israel works very close together.
Yep.
Yeah. And so to get away this kind of infiltration, it looks a little bit difficult at the moment.
Well, this web that you've outlined and all of you have discussed is quite frightening. And when you look at local issues that are happening in these towns all around the world, they have no clue what's going on. And I think this kind of podcast, these kinds of shows help people to get a better perspective of all of the linkages and how this web works and how the deep state works and how America has been playing a deeper role. We were having a bigger conversation about Gaddafi last night and how the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, murdered him and how it impacted, that part of the region. And now this is a big explosion of slavery that's happening in that region that people aren't talking about because state-run news don't want you to understand what's really going on in that part of the world. And I just find it fascinating that, this government that talks about democracy works every day against democracy. And, that every time somebody says the word democracy, I just scream. Because this country is a constitutional republic and we should be operationalizing ourselves that way. But that's a dream now. And I don't even think that's a reality anymore, because I don't even think the average citizen even understands what that means, that every individual has the right to fight back and dissent against things that are impacting their private lives or their country or their group or their community. And, this whole movement with digital currency, and it's just a frightening thing. And all of the stuff that happened since COVID, I think has been a good thing because we're all talking about this in a bigger way. And we're not looking to talk about it on mainstream media. I mean, state-run media, and people are starting to pay attention. I don't know if you guys are seeing it, but I hear a lot of conversations that I've never heard before in a lot of places that I'm shocked about. So people are paying attention, Vanessa, and they just need to get fed more information because they're looking for the information. Might not know it as well as we do, but Vanessa, the work that you're doing is incredible. I have to go back and read your stuff. I'm going to go back today and read all of your stuff today. I read a little bit of it because I've been on the road, but I got to tell you, it's just great to have this conversation with you, because even for me, you're giving me a deeper dive on some of the issues that I need to be concerned about.
And I want to add to that, Kevin, that's why it is so, with this platform, I feel like I'm doing a significant role, to bring together, because I wish I could do more, but I couldn't be in the army right now. Although when I was growing up, I wanted to be a military nurse. I wanted to be a missionary nurse, and my father said no. Okay. So, but talking about that, because look, in terms of connectivity, a lot of people don't even know what that means in terms of like a proxy war. Like when Hartmut mentioned about there's so many, Israelis also are behind Ukraine, and the Ukrainian soldiers are also in Africa fighting the wars. And if you think about it, why are they there? But they're all just pawns. And recently, Drago, you just wrote about the cyber attacks, and I know, Vanessa, months ago you had that article and an interview, and you focus on the Israeli digital, that their massive work going through the NGOs, and they had a big event in UK. So maybe you could speak more of that, and you and Drago could connect more about the cyber attack that's happening, because that's also a scary cyber attacks.
Yeah, I mean, I just also wanted to mention about Ukraine, because you've not only got, you know, the IDF, or the IOF, as I call them, the Israeli Occupation Forces. They had a brigade during the 2014 coup, you know, in Maidan and so on. And there are literal IOF soldiers fighting in Ukraine, although I'm sure most of them have been recalled now to Israel to fight there. But you've also got the circulation of people, mercenaries from Britain, for example, and from the United States, who were fighting in Syria alongside the Kurdish countries, and who are now fighting in Ukraine. ISIS have gone from Syria to Ukraine. And so, you know, this is I always used to describe it, it's just like a percolating mercenary terrorist force, proxy force, that NATO moves around from war theater to war theater, depending on where they're required. But yeah, I mean, you know, the whole kind of cyber development by Israel is kind of terrifying, because if you look, I mean, where it all is generated from, of course, is Unit 8200, the military spy unit. And members of Unit 8200 then create their own tech surveillance startups. Many of them are embedded in those organizations in the US and in the UK, like Oracle, like Palantir, and so on and so forth. There's, you know, there's probably thousands of them where Unit 8200 is involved. And if you look at how that surveillance is being tested on Palestinians, so you have the AI technology of Lavender, of Gospel, that is providing identification, or its alleged identification, of militants in Gaza, which is enabling the Israeli forces to slaughter tens of thousands of Palestinians on the basis of this AI identification. And they've actually said it's not reliable. But this is what is effectively being used. You have surveillance cameras all the way around the perimeter of Gaza. I've experienced that myself, where you have automatic machine guns, and they're recalibrated on a regular basis, so that some days the farmers can go up to 2 meters from the fence without getting shot. Some days it's 10 meters. It changes all the time. So those farmers, even in peacetime, are being constantly shot at. In West Bank, the surveillance there is terrifying. I mean, they're living in what is effectively 15-minute cities, but of course they don't have the ability to go where they want because of the apartheid system in Israel. So all of this surveillance technology, which has been tested on Palestinians with catastrophic effect and consequences for Palestinians, is now effectively being introduced into societies in the West. And personally, I find that utterly terrifying, because we're not at war right now, but we're getting really close to the point where if you are dissenting against your government, then potentially you're going to be surveilled by these organizations. Oracle is vacuuming up information from the health sector, the education sector, the militaries. All of the British Ministry of Defense information is stored on Oracle. Oracle is a self-professed Israeli supporting organization, so a Zionist supporting organization. They don't employ anyone if they don't support Zionist Israel. So am I happy to have all my personal information, all my banking information, all of my medical information on a file at Oracle? No.
I mean, I can confirm that from a military standpoint as well, because the Oracle, or specifically Google, I think 5 or 6 years ago, they started this project called Maven, which is essentially a fusion of all surveillance equipment that you can imagine, including phones and cameras and anything, essentially any electronic device with an internet connection that you have. And then that's used for guidance. That's used for, and when I say guidance, I mean weapons guidance. That's used for spying. That's used for anything. That's also used for infiltrating the various cyber warfare programs into somebody's computer, telephone, and so on and so on. And they actually tried using this in Ukraine against the Russians, which is where you see the clash of these incredible technologies, because the Russians have very, very advanced electronic warfare systems, and they were able to disrupt these things. And worse yet, for the US and NATO, they were able to locate the command centers for the Maven project and then obliterate them with hypersonic missiles and bombs. So essentially, we see that everything is being prepared for a major war. And this sort of war will be unlike anything we've ever seen in the entire history of mankind. And we've seen a lot of bloodshed in our history, but the extent to which the technologies that we have today affect our lives, I don't think we've ever had that.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, not forgetting something like the Pegasus spyware, of course, which was also used fairly recently against journalists and so on.
I have one last question, Vanessa. What is your opinion with respect to the people in Gaza and in Palestine? Because we had the news about the, let's say, negotiation proposal from the US and Israel, which was rejected by Hamas. And
it wasn't okay.
It was rejected. Yeah. Because if you don't need to stop the war, if you don't need to stop your occupation, if you don't need to stop anything, what is the point of negotiations? But do you see still hope for the people in Gaza and Palestine, or do you think they have to escape? They have to leave this area because this is obviously the target of Israel, because nothing is there anymore. You have no infrastructure. You have no houses. It is all it's all gone. So the question is, do the people in Gaza and in Palestine really have the hope to stay there, or do you think there will come the time when the suffering is so huge that they have to leave this area?
First of all, I just want to clarify, because that's why I called the ceasefire a sadistic farce, because Hamas have accepted since May, they've accepted two proposals. The one proposal that Biden actually rammed through the UN Security Council was accepted by Hamas. But what happens is that Netanyahu then changes it, and he adds other conditions to it. So, for example, Hamas accepted back on July the 2nd. Netanyahu introduced other provisions. Hamas rejected them, but this is what they want them to do, because then they want to portray it as Hamas rejecting the ceasefire, which is completely dishonest. But it absolves Netanyahu of blame. And if you actually look at who is saying Netanyahu has accepted it, it's Blinken. Netanyahu never says he accepts it. Why does he never say he accepts it? Because he would be slaughtered by his own far-right members of his coalition. So Netanyahu has never actually accepted a ceasefire, ever. Blinken says he does, and Blinken says Hamas has rejected it. But in reality, what happened this time, Yahya Sinwar, who's the new leader of Hamas since they assassinated Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. And this, by the way, was the first answer. This was the first retaliation by the resistance. This was a glorious day here in West Asia when Yahya Sinwar was elected leader of Hamas. Why? Because Yahya is traditionally a fighter, he's traditionally a strategist, and he's traditionally completely united with the entire resistance axis. What Israel were hoping by killing Ismail Haniyeh, they would have Khalid Mashal re-elected, who betrayed the resistance axis, enabled the destabilization of Syria, and had since 2017 been sidelined from Hamas by Nasrallah, who was trying to basically bring Hamas back into the resistance axis fold. So it's a very complex situation here. All of us here were like, please God, not Mashal. But when they elected Yahya Sinwar, this was such a powerful message to Israel, because it was basically saying, you know, stuff you, we're going to keep fighting. And not only are we going to keep fighting, what Sinwar has now done is to unite West Bank and Gaza completely. West Bank, 90% of the resistance in West Bank will follow Yahya Sinwar. They hate Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of Fatah, because he's just seen as a tax collector for the Zionist regime. So this was already the first step in retaliation from the resistance axis. And it's something which really re-energized the resistance movement. And by that, I mean across all the countries that formed the resistance axis. So when you're talking about the conditions in Gaza, yes, I mean, you know, they're untenable. What is going on right now is like something out of the worst horror movie you can possibly imagine. I mean, it's just, there aren't any words actually to describe it. It's hideous. But there's two things here. One is, where do Palestinians go? Egypt has refused entry to them. I mean, Egypt has betrayed Palestine since the Camp David agreements in '79. And the Sisi regime is a complete Zionist captured government in Egypt. I don't have time to go into all the detail of that, but it's at my Substack. I wrote a 3-part series on how Egypt is completely sold out. It's the Ukraine of West Asia. That's how I see it. Everything is sold out in Egypt. Gaza is an open air extermination camp. So, you know, where do they go? But at the same time, what Netanyahu wants to happen is that Palestine is completely killed. And the resistance axis is not going to allow this to happen, because Palestine is, if you like, the central cause of that resistance axis. We know what Netanyahu wants. He's made it very clear with his dystopian project for Gaza, which will be a kind of free trade zone under the control of normalized Arab states, with kind of little cantons where Palestinians who reject any kind of resistance are going to be allowed to survive. I won't say live. And the whole area will benefit from Palestinian gas, from Palestinian industry, from Palestinian resources, and Palestinians will just be slave labor, basically.
This is a very important point, because this is the reason why I think no Western country will do anything to stop this, because all the countries are looking forward to get the gas and the oil, which will be exploited by the Israelis.
Yeah. And that's the whole Levant coast, by the way, because there's gas off the coast of Syria, which is why, of course, one of the reasons that Syria was being targeted, off the coast of Lebanon and off the coast of Gaza. So this entire coastal area. And don't forget the what is it? The India Middle East Economic Corridor. So there will be you know, rail and road from Mumbai through the Gulf states, through Gaza to El Arij, and from there to Europe, which of course is in direct competition with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mhm.
And that's another reason that Israel is so important, because it's a buffer against the threat of the Belt and Road Initiative.
So there are only, in my opinion, there are only two possibilities. The one possibility is that all the people in Gaza and Palestine will be killed, which would be the most horrific situation at all. Or they are going to escape to Europe. This is what I see, my personal opinion. And because I don't see that that Israel will stop this war.
I don't think it will stop the war, but we haven't yet had the major retaliation from the resistance axis, and we don't know what that is going to entail. I mean, I know from being here that Hezbollah and Ansarullah and the Islamic resistance in Iraq and all of the other associated resistance non-state actors in the region are ready. Their retaliation is ready. They're waiting for Iran. Now, Iran, in my opinion, is preparing for the response from Israel. So it's preparing its defenses, it's working. I'd be interested to get Drago's opinion on this. Well, Russia on the electronic warfare systems. It's preparing its air defenses because it knows it's not going to end with any kind of retaliation from Iran. This is what Israel wants. And this is what Israel is dragging the United States into. 1/3, I think, of the US naval assets and its allied assets from the UK and France and Holland and so on have all been moved into the kind of Mediterranean area around Cyprus, the Gulf of Oman, I think, the Red Sea, etc. So surrounding West Asia. 1/3 of their assets, according to a number of reports. Now, in my opinion, and again, I'd be really interested to see what Drago says as a military expert, that also means that they're sitting ducks. For me, like it almost looks to me as if Iran is waiting for them all to kind of be in one place and within range. Maybe that's wishful thinking on my part. But, you know, this isn't going to be like the retaliation in April, which was relatively staged. It was prepared in advance. All of the allies of Israel knew it was coming and could prepare for it. It was kind of a show of force by Iran, but not a very major show of force. Still, it had an effect. But this was, for me, a kind of a bit of a theatrical retaliation in a way. What we're looking at now is a major retaliation from the entire resistance axis. I mean, you need to understand the Iranian culture to understand the seriousness of killing a guest in Tehran in the IRGC guest house. I mean, you know, this just doesn't happen in that kind of culture. It has to be avenged. It has to be. So it's coming. But in my opinion, Iran is preparing for what comes after that. So I'd be interested to hear Drago's opinion.
When it comes to the response, I think it's not wishful thinking at all. I think you're right, because most of the assets that are supposed to target Iran are naval. And if you have very good anti-ship missiles, those can be destroyed. The only problem that I see is Iran should enhance its precision strike capabilities, which means they need better satellites, they need better guidance, and so on. That might be an issue. However, the real problem for Iran are the submarines. And this is why the Americans could have put those low-yield warheads that I talked about before, they could have put them on ships, but ships are very easy targets. Submarines are extremely difficult to detect, nearly impossible to destroy, unless you have very good anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which, for example, the Russians and the Chinese have, and are the only ones who could actually match the U.S. capabilities in that regard. What's happening now is that the Russians are installing all these electronic warfare systems and more advanced air defenses in Iran, and more importantly, they're getting these Su-35 fighter jets, which are the only ones that could essentially help Iran maintain aerial superiority over its own airspace. I think Iran will be able to retaliate against most of the assets that will try to destroy it. However, these submarines are going to become a really, really big problem. I mean, they already are, but in the event of major war in the Middle East, it's going to be really, really dangerous, because they will be able to, the Iranians and the Israelis and the Americans will be able to launch these extremely effective pinpoint strikes against the most important targets in Iran. So they don't have to destroy the entire country; they just have to destroy the ruling structure of the country, and that's what they will be trying to do if things escalate.
Sorry, can I just ask one quick question? Will they be able to target, because the many of the weapons are stored underground, as they are here in Syria and in Lebanon and so on? Are you saying that those missiles from the submarines will have the yield to be able to actually damage those underground facilities?
Well, I mean, theoretically, they should be able to, because back in 2007, the Obama administration launched this so-called superfuse technology research, which essentially controls the direction of the yield of a nuclear weapon, making it a lot more capable in terms of penetration. So, but the real problem with that is not that they will target these weapon facilities or weapon storage areas that are underground. The problem is the leadership. The Iranian leadership, the leadership of any country of the axis of the resistance, because if they destroy the leadership, which I think they have the capability to do, it's going to be a really big problem for the axis of the resistance, because it will be essentially beheaded, or they will be essentially, what the U.S. and Iran and Israel will do is the so-called decapitation strike, which they talk about openly, and it's like it's a viable strategy. It's considered a viable strategy in the Pentagon. I recently talked to Pepe Escobar, and he told me that they try to kill Putin just on the July 28th. So this is an effective strategy that they will try to use. And like if you look at Russia, Russia has tens of thousands of agents that can protect Putin and the rest of the leadership. Countries like Iran or Iraq or Syria, they're much less capable in that regard. They're very capable, but they're not a superpower level capable. So that's the real issue that I see. And I think if Iran is preparing for anything, they have to prepare a way to ensure the succession of power in the case that something like this happens, in order to just stay viable as a state.
What I want to mention is that Iran is a very difficult country to conquer, because in the Millennium Challenge 2002, which is 22 years old, by General Paul von Riper, it was shown that it was nearly impossible for the U.S. to conquer Iran because of its geographic situation and their military. The only way to attack Iran is submarine. I agree with this 100%.
Yeah,
I mean, they don't have to conquer it. They just need to destroy its power structure in order to eliminate it as a geostrategic threat. That's the whole idea of their strategy, I think.
I understand, yeah.
Well, thank you all. Anyone wants to add?
No, Vanessa, it was great. It was great I taught so much by you. I'm just so happy I made the call today. I've been running around. I'm so happy I made the call. I mean, I've been a part of these conversations in so many places, but you just bring it to focus. And I appreciate you. I really do. I really appreciate you.
All right, thank you. Well, it was great having you all on and all the different opinions and expertise. And, you know, it is really nice to have this kind of conversation where everyone's contributing something and adding to it and enriching it. So I really appreciate it as well. I mean, I'm just bringing one perspective. It becomes more developed by speaking to people like you.
Well, I hope to get to meet you soon, and I would love to bring you on a show to talk to a whole nother diverse group of people that are really interested in this issue. I have some dynamite people in my life that live all over the world, and they're interested in it. I mean, I get bombarded by stuff all the time, but it's just great to be able to have a real good civil conversation about what's happening in the world.
Yeah, no, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Grace, and Roy for organizing it, as always.
Thank you.
You're all very welcome. I don't usually know how to end it except being grateful to all your presence and all your work. And yeah, please support Vanessa Beeley. She's got that patreon.com. And of course, you could always find Vanessa Beeley and follow her in billy.substack.com. And then, you know, from one conversation, one newsletter, then you'll get more of her connections. And Drago, thank you for mentioning your conversation with Pepe Escobar, because in my mind, I did an ESP on you. I said, please share something about Pepe Escobar, because that was kind of like my big dream. I thought Vanessa was there too, but I know that Matthew was there as well. So all your favorite people of mine, thank you for all the work that you do. And if you want to support my work as well, you can just do a Venmo at Grace Asagra. And definitely, if you're so stressed with everything that's happening, and I recommend quantum resonance supplements, and you could always email me. No Telegram crazy phone calls, because, but email will be a little bit formal. So, and then I could help you tailor your recommendations. And again, Roy, Hartmut, Drago, Kevin, and Vanessa, you're all my family from a distance. I give you hugs and support and like everything that each and every one of us are doing. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.